Okay, friends, I am about to try to summarize about 1,000 years of history really, really quickly in this short video for the purpose of talking about people's ideas about government. So, do what you need to do, speed it up, slow it down, stop, whatever works for you. I'm just going to kind of go as fast as I can and see what happens. So, let's start by just reviewing quickly some words that we talked about in class. We talked about the idea that there is this theory of government called democracy, where you try to let people vote to make decisions. And we talked about how that could be either a direct democracy, where people vote on all decisions and participate in all the decisions, or it could be a representative democracy, where people elect representatives and then those representatives make decisions for them. And that's also called a republic. We also talked about the idea of autocracy, where the government is run by one person. And there are two different kinds. There's a monarchy, where the government is made up of kings or queens. There's a lot of different words in different cultures, but this is the idea that only one person is in charge because of their bloodline and that they inherit their leadership, versus the idea of dictatorship, where some strong person takes over and controls, strong militarily usually, controls things on their own. And then the next dictator is chosen basically based on a fight and whoever is the strongest. So we talked about all these ideas of government, but now I want to try to put that in some historical context. And the last kind of non-government that we talked about is the idea of anarchy, that there isn't a government at all, that people just do whatever they're going to do. And there's some fairly sophisticated ideas about how that could possibly work, but generally speaking, this is what's happening when we're fighting about what kind of government to have. I should say that when I talk about the history of government, I am only telling you the history that we know, and I'm also only telling you sometimes the history that happens by series of coincidences to have influenced things that are happening today the most. So this picture actually shows a Lukasa from the Central African area, and this is something people used to use to tell history as a series of oral stories. Instead of writing it down, they would make a mnemonic tool to remember what they had to say, and they would use this to tell you a story. Those kinds of histories have often been ignored because of racism, or have been wiped out because they're oral histories, they weren't written down and they got lost. And then even some written histories were lost to us as those written histories got destroyed. So I'm telling you a story about things that were influential, and it's definitely not all the stories there are to tell, or things that we happen to remember because of the way that racism and tragedy and listening and not listening has happened in the history of the world. So in your textbook, the beginning of democracy and ideas about democracy is always pointed to as Greece. That is probably not true. There were many places in the world where people experiment with democracy, but Greek democracy is definitely influential because of a series of coincidences about how we are able to remember it, which I'm going to tell you about when we get there. And when people talk about Greek democracy, they're usually talking about Athens, which was a city-state inside of the peninsula, the Greek peninsula. This is a picture from Athens, and you may recognize the Parthenon, very famous building. It's actually not a government building, even though our government buildings today often look like this. This is actually a religious temple that the Greeks used to worship the goddess Athena, who was the patron saint of Athens. And I'm here telling you about Athens in ancient Greece because hundreds of years before the Common Era, they had in Athens, Greece, a very vibrant democracy. And what's actually important in this picture is this little wall here, because if you look backwards from this wall, you would see this, which is called the Pnyx. And this is a place where the Athenian Greeks practiced their democracy. So they needed a really wide open space like this because they allowed all different group, all kinds of people from the community to come and make decisions together. And so someone would get up here and speak and then come back down, and then they would vote and make decisions as a group. It was not very inclusive because they did not allow enslaved people, of which they had many, because they were at war with other states, and they would take slaves from other nearby towns and states. They didn't allow slaves to vote, and they didn't allow women to vote. So it was kind of a select group, but it was still a very large group. And it's considered a direct democracy because so many people were able to participate in so many different kinds of decisions, acting as a community here at the Pinks. This is a statue of Pericles, who expanded and developed that Athenian democracy. And so Pericles had the idea, how do we get the most people involved in democracy? And he created things like juries of thousands of people. He had the idea of paying people for their time to go to meetings so that more people would participate. And that had the effect of making Athenian democracy very one of the most expansive democracies, maybe, at that time. Something just to know about these statues is that they look very white, but this is a Greek person, and so probably in real life, when not carved in white stone, he was very dark-skinned and very dark-haired. And so it's just important to remember that sometimes our sense of history is skewed by the way these statues look. If this guy walked down the street today, he would probably be called a person of color. And here's another picture in Athens, Greece, in which the painter has made people look very white. This is a painting about the philosopher from Athens, from that time in Athens, named Socrates. And so you're probably a little familiar with Socrates because you've done maybe Socratic circles in your ninth grade English class. And that Socrates had the idea the best way to learn is by asking and answering questions. So that's what a Socratic circle is. Socrates also had a bunch of other ideas, and that is what led to what's going on in this picture. The artist is trying to tell you about an event in Socrates' life. And just look around here. Here's Socrates in the middle, making the universal symbol for, I want to tell you something. And with his other hand, reaching out for this glass or vase of drink here. But notice all the other people in the room. See how upset they are? They're like, this guy's pounding his head on the wall. This guy's crying. This guy's crying. These are Socrates' followers, and they are upset because the Athenian democracy voted to have Socrates killed. Socrates, on all of his questions and his popularity with young people, was driving everyone nuts, and he was irritating and annoying, and they decided that he should be sentenced to death. And they voted on it democratically, and they agreed. And the majority wanted him to be killed. And Socrates believed so much in democracy that he accepted their verdict, drank what is in this glass, which is a poison, hemlock, and died. So Socrates was a big fan of democracy. This picture actually has him in prison. See the shackles down here? And his followers are very upset because they want him not to follow the democracy and not to die. One of those followers is an important philosopher, and his name was Plato. So Plato learned from this experience that Socrates had, and he said, you know what, democracy is really stupid, because what happens in a democracy is a bunch of stupid people get together and they make stupid decisions. And what should really happen, Plato said, is we shouldn't have a democracy, we should have a monarchy, but a special kind of monarchy Plato envisioned, in which the smartest people in town would somehow magically become the dictator or the monarch, and he called them philosopher king. Obviously, he wasn't really specific about how all this was going to happen, because it didn't happen in his lifetime. It was a democracy. So Plato's idea was maybe democracy is not good, and instead we should have smart people rule over everyone else. At around the same time in China, thousands of miles away in the world, there was a big battle going on between a number of different kings and princes, or you might say monarchs of various powers. And the borders that we now know as China did not exist. There were many different kingdoms, and they were at war with each other. And it happened that in that place and in that time, a man who we refer to as Confucius. His Chinese name probably sounds a little bit more like Gongfuzi. Confucius traveled around to all of these different communities and observed all these different leaders. And he said, I have an idea about what would make a good government. I believe in monarchy, but I think that the idea of good government and a good society is obedience and care. That just like children should obey their parents, people should obey their ruler. And just like parents care for their children, rulers' jobs, kings' jobs, is to care for the people. And so, what a good king is someone who cares for the people and supports them. And if kings stop caring for people and setting a good example by being good people, then the people should rise up and get rid of their king and replace him with someone who is better at their job. So, it's an interesting idea about monarchy, but what the role of the monarch is. In Confucius's idea, the social contract that we were talking about in class is one where the ruler's job is to be a good person and to treat people well. And if they do that job, they get to keep their power. Back in Europe, the Greek governments fell apart and were taken over by a government out of the city of Rome in Italy that spread to the entire Mediterranean area. And the Roman Empire, which you might have seen some of these things the Romans built, like this is an aqueduct to bring water into their towns so that people could have showers and baths, something very unusual in the ancient world. But the other thing that the Romans are famous for is their government. So the Roman Empire, in part of its history, had a democracy, but it was a huge empire. And so in order to do democracy, they did not have everyone come to the same place like in Athens, Greece. What they did was they had people elected from each little area, and then those representatives came to the capital in Rome to make decisions. So here you have the Roman Parliament, which they called the Senate, and we still use that word. And here's a little space preset for each of the representatives to come and a place for them to speak to each other and make decisions. Again, they did not allow women to vote. They did not allow enslaved people to vote, despite the fact that they did enslave a lot of people. Not the kind of slavery we had in the United States, but still a form of slavery. But they did develop some ideas about representative government in this way, and some words that we still use today. One of their ideas was that a good government should always write down the laws so that everyone can know what the laws are. And they built this place in Rome called the Forum, where people could go and talk, and on the walls would be written the new laws that had just been passed so that everyone could read them along with the news of the day. They also wanted to divide up the responsibilities in government. So the Senate made laws, but they also had an executive function, people whose job was to carry out the laws, and a judicial branch where there were judges who would interpret the law so that if everyone was disagreeing about how the law should be applied, they would go to a judge and the judge would help them make that decision. So in this way, the Romans set up a bunch of things that we look back on and that are very influential. After the Romans, though, people gave up on the idea during the time of the Roman Empire, people gave up on the idea of democracy. And in fact, the Romans had this idea that in order to make war, they needed to make decisions really quickly. So they elected a dictator to tell them how to run the war. And then the dictator was supposed to step aside and let the democracy take over as soon as the war was over. So they came up with the word dictator. But in the end, their dictators would not let go of power. So they ended up with emperors, and you're thinking of maybe the Roman Emperor Julius Caesar and such. And after a long time of experimenting with dictatorship like that, they ended up eventually, their whole society sort of fell apart. And Europe came to be a bunch of different states, each ruled by a king. And so this period in Europe was called the Dark Ages or the Middle Ages. The dark because it really sucked. And we think of it as the Middle Ages as a time of knights and shining armor and castles and princesses. And in reality, those castles were cold and dark and stinky because they had bad bathroom facilities. And people were just barely surviving, and it was really pretty miserable time. So it's called the Dark Ages. The social system in the Dark Ages or the Middle Ages was called a feudal system, as both an economic system and a system of government. So it had a king and then a bunch of who owned everything and controlled everything, and then a bunch of noblemen, barons, knights, dukes, those kind of things, whose job was to work for the king and control different parts of the king's land. And then the vast majority, over 90% of the people in Europe, were what was called serfs, meaning that they were basically pieces of property that belonged to the king, that were controlled by the noblemen, and whose only job was to work the land and farm so that everyone else could eat. A small number of people at this level of society were free. Those folks would do things like run stores or make crafts for sale. But mostly people were sort of tied to the land, and most people were considered the property of the king. So this feudal system lasted for quite some time, and the kings of that day were what they call absolute monarchs. They had total power. They were able to dictate everything and tell everyone what to do. This is a portrait of a king. It's from Russia, and these kind of portraits were made because people didn't have cameras. So you would sit for days and days and days while a painter painted the picture. A king would have made a very careful decision about what to put in a picture like this. So notice how this king is showing off all his bling, yeah? And he's also showing off that he can read, which is kind of a thing in the Middle Ages, and that he has like lots of paperwork to do. But he's also showing off the staff that has the symbol of the cross on it. And he's got another cross here on his crown. The point is to remind you that he gets his power from God. The idea in the Middle Ages was that kings get their power from God, that is called divine right, that God chooses some people and their children and their children's children to rule over everyone else and to own everything. And the king speaks for God. And so the reason why people were following the king was because they believed in this religious idea. That all started to fall apart in about 1200 in the Common Era, because the nobles forced the king to agree to share power with him. And we're going to talk more about that in the next video, so I won't go into it. But the idea was that the king started to have to share power with other people, and that led to a whole series of other changes in Europe. But first, I want to go back and talk about what was going on in the Americas at this time. In the Americas, in this same time, in the New York area of where we now have New York, the state of New York, a group of indigenous folks formed a government called the Iroquois Confederacy. And this is a very interesting government that had a lot of influence on our later thinking. The idea was formed by this historical person named Skinenrohawi, called Skinenrohawi. And Skinenrohawi and his cohort, Hiawatha, got together a whole bunch of people and got them to agree to form a union between 5, later 7 different tribes. The idea was that these tribes needed to get together and stop fighting. And they developed a kind of government based on this idea. Inside of the tribes, most of the decisions were made by women, and the women then chose a man to speak for the tribe at a confederate meeting of all the tribes. Confederate here just means a group, grouping them together. And in this larger group, decisions were made about what to do outside the Confederacy, and also about relationships between the different communities. Those decisions were made unusually for us in our story by consensus, meaning that people didn't just vote, but they had to all agree. All of the representatives had to agree. This is not so much about everyone really agreeing as everyone eventually getting to the point where they agree to disagree and to move forward on something that seems to fit. So this idea of different tribes and different groups of people having individual freedom and individual control, but also working together by consensus, comes from the Iroquois Confederacy in the United States. And the Iroquois Confederacy still exists, but it was started in about 1100 year of the Common Era. And so back in Europe, something interesting happened after the 1200s, after kings started to have their power constrained. A series of coincidences, really. The books from Greece and Rome had been saved in a library in Istanbul, what's now called Istanbul in Turkey. And it happened that those books were still in, they went from the control of a Christian empire to the control of a Muslim empire, but they were still in existence when an idea came from China called the printing press, and people began to be able to make large numbers of copies of books very easily. And those books got translated and circulated all around Europe so that everyone started reading suddenly what the Greeks and Romans had thought about government. And they started to have these meetings called salons, where people would get together and argue about government and what kind of government. A very interesting idea, because they were giving up on the thinking that kings knew everything and starting to talk about their own ideas and what was in their own brain. And not only that, but they started to write books about what they were thinking. And this led to a whole explosion of philosophy called the Enlightenment. So it's like the light coming on in the darkness of the Middle Ages, and suddenly everyone had something to say. And so some of the books that are written that are important. Thomas Hobbes wrote a book, and he said he was living in a time when there was a lot of war in England. And he said, I noticed that people are equal to each other, that there is not a better king and lesser other people, but in fact, people are equal. Their equality makes them compete with each other. They're always trying to be better than each other, even though they're not. This competition leads to violence. And so what I think the social contract is, according to Hobbes, his idea, is that people they know they need a king to protect them from each other, from fighting with each other. And people will voluntarily give up their power to a king because they would hope that that powerful king will protect them from this competition that they have with each other. So Hobbes believed that the social contract would lead to us all wanting a king. On the other hand, a man named Rousseau wrote a book. Rousseau lived in Switzerland, where he grew up in a little tiny village where everyone would meet on Friday and drink some beer and make some decisions. And he said, wow, I noticed that people are equal to each other, and that they're also really smart, and they do good things when they discuss them with each other. So I think that what people really want is a direct democracy where they can all get together and make decisions together. And I think that the social contract is what happens when people make a deal to care for each other and listen to each other and work together. And that's what people want out of a government. In France, Baron de Montesquieu wrote a book, and he said, no, what's going on is that anytime anyone gets any kind of power in society, they become greedy, they want more power, they become corrupt, they start selling their power to the highest bidder. And so power is something to be worried about. Any kind of government's going to shouldn't have too much power. So what we should do is we should use the Roman idea, divide the power into 3 branches, separate the power so that each group of people in society, or each instrument of power in society, can control and stop the other from getting out of control. And so he went back to this idea of 3 branches of government. One part makes the laws, one part acts on the laws, and one part determines what the laws mean whenever there's an argument, and each can stop each other from having too much power. Mary Wollstonecraft wrote a book, and being the only woman in this group, she had some different ideas. She said, I see the way y'all treat women, and I see that when you make women less than, that you are actually hurting men too, because then men who are controlling women don't get the benefit of women's ideas and thoughts and contributions. And so if I know that about what's going on between men and women, then it's also true about what's going on between kings and people, that when kings have too much power, they're actually hurting themselves because they don't get access to all the ideas and wonderful contributions that the people could make if only they had more power. So she said, monarchy is wrong, just like treating women bad is wrong, just like slavery is wrong. And the right kind of government would be a direct democracy where everyone participates fully and everyone gets to contribute and realize their full potential. John Locke wrote a book, and he said, I noticed that when people are born, they are born equal, and that God gives them all certain rights that he believes that just that because we're alive, that God wants us to have life, liberty, and the opportunity to own our own stuff, which he called property. And so since God gave us all these rights, it's the job of governments that we might create to protect our rights. And the social contract is a contract between the people and the government, that the government will protect people's individual rights. He said, if a government isn't doing that, then you should overthrow it and have a revolution. And the way that you would run this government that he imagined is you would elect smart people from among you to act in a way that protects your rights. So he believed in a representative kind of government. So I'm hoping that what you can see here is that there's a whole bunch of different ideas coming out of this history about what government is supposed to do. And even though we haven't seen everybody's ideas, we've seen some ideas that we can look at and study more. Some ideas about some of the questions people were thinking about that we've just talked about is, what is the nature of humans? Are humans basically good and they need their freedom? Or are they basically bad and selfish and they need to be controlled? What about the social contract? What kind of a deal did we make when we came into this world, gave up a little bit of freedom, and asked for a government to be in existence? Was it a lot of freedom that we intended to give up, or just a little bit? What did we expect the government to do in exchange for the freedom that we give up to it? And we can see that democracy and autocracy have advantages and disadvantages. So which one is better overall? Sorry for the misspellings. If we choose democracy, then how should it be structured to get the best results? Should everyone be able to participate? Should there be representatives, 3 branches, all these kind of questions? So your job for this week is to check out just a few of these philosophers and learn about them in a little bit greater detail. And then we will apply some of these ideas to learning about a little more about the history of government in our next video. And I will talk to you then.